thank you very much for coming this morning. I think it's going to be an interesting conversation. And so, first of all, could you introduce yourself to the people that are watching the video?
Sure. Thanks, Yousef. I'm pretty excited about being here. I think we've had a lot of good conversations over the course of the last few weeks. Hopefully this helps other students at Rochester as well. I'm Sandeep Madhur. I graduated from Rochester in 2007 with a dual degree in economics and mathematics. Ended up moving and working in finance for the first 5-6 years of my career, covering software companies. Ended up then switching over to the software industry, initially starting out in the finance role within software companies. And now I'm currently a consultant for high growth software companies, kind of really helping out with their sales strategy, sales planning, and sales analytics.
Great. Thank you so much for that introduction. And for the people that are watching us currently, my name is Yousef Ouenniche, and I'm a junior in data science. And so hopefully this will be helpful for you. And so Sandeep, could you tell us a little bit more about like going back a few years, your college experience and how that influenced kind of your career path and how you kind of switched around?
Yeah, sure. So I was probably in the minority of people, coming into Rochester having some idea of what I wanted to do. I was, my dad's an economist. Growing up in the dinner table, we talk about macroeconomic theories and people and all sorts of interesting sort of real world things that are happening in the economy, in the global economy, in the local economy. So I felt very convinced that I wanted to go become an economist as well myself. And I wanted to do an economics PhD. So I kind of came in, and part of the reason why I chose Rochester is kind of phenomenal economics program with great professors. And so that's what I wanted to do when I first joined. And then over the course of my 4 years at Rochester, I realized that maybe economics PhD wasn't exactly the thing that I wanted to go do. As I got introduced to finance, the capital markets, the financial markets, I just found that much more dynamic and much more real world than sort of maybe the more theoretical side of economics and mathematics. And so sort of pivoted my interests and sort of what I wanted to do after undergrad from going sort of the PhD route to more sort of working in an investment bank.
It's interesting. And I remember like in the last conversation, you mentioned how you kind of, your perspective of economics kind of changed as you went through the classes and kind of discovered what it entailed. And so I think that's interesting. But could you tell us more about kind of the pivot of how you switched interests and ended up with your first internship in finance? Like, I remember when I came here, I actually was interested in finance in my first year, and ended up kind of changing paths as well. And everyone was telling me how hard it was to get into finance and get an internship in finance. So I remember didn't know what a super day was, and it kind of like was this super scary thing. And so how did that work out for you?
Yeah, no, it's funny looking back how it did work out because at the time it was definitely very nerve-wracking, and also just it was very uncertain. But I got pretty lucky that there was a program that I don't believe that we still do, or I think we do a different version of it. It was called In a New York Minute, where they would help a bunch of students who were interested in finance. It would help them go to New York and then kind of do not really a super day, but like a super day of like informational interviews. So not quite like interviewing for an internship, but interviewing with alums that could kind of help answer some questions. And that I was really fortunate to have been a part of, because that really opened up my eyes to financial markets and finance in general. And then the other thing was, through that, I ended up following up with some of the people that I met there, and actually ended up getting an internship in the wealth management department of, I guess back then called Merrill Lynch, now Bank of America Merrill Lynch. And so that was between my sophomore and junior year. And through that, just kind of living in New York as a young, adult, sort of breathing the finance world, working with people and sort of understanding like how they invest and so where they invest and what kind of, what are sort of the trade-offs that they think of when they're investing was just fascinating to me. And particularly, as part of the job in wealth management, when you're sort of managing the money of relatively high net worth individuals, you ended up having to read about research reports where analysts would cover a different sector and they would say, hey, this company, this stock is going to go up because of XYZ. And I just found that really fascinating. I'm naturally very curious about a lot of different things, and I just found it really fascinating. And the more I did that over the course of that summer, the more I realized, like, hey, this equity research thing is something that I really want to pursue, or I find it just naturally very interesting. And so I knew kind of going into my junior year that I wanted to go for equity research. Relative to sort of the other divisions within investment bank, I was kind of fortunate to have that experience and that exposure. And then it was just a matter of, working hard, like trying to make as many connections as possible, reaching out to as many recruiters as possible. And fortunately with JP Morgan, ended up getting, I think it was like a random like Monday or something in February of 2006. They said, hey, can you come down to New York on Friday? Would love to interview. Had an actual super day, which was like, I think something like 6 interviews back to back. And was really lucky and very fortunate because clearly my passion for the thing stood out. Got an offer for the summer internship that day itself, so had a pretty good weekend and a ride back, and then ended up doing that summer internship over the course of junior and senior year, and then that translated into the full-time job after undergrad.
It's amazing and very inspiring. I guess that kind of exposure that you get, especially early on in your sophomore year, actually like allows you to kind of understand a little bit more how everything works and know which kind of direction you would want to go into, especially as a future young professional at the time. But you ended up actually switching careers afterwards, going like from finance to still doing finance, but in software and now in consulting and in sales. So how did that happen? Can you kind of like walk us through kind of like decisions that you made? What made you change careers in the first place? And yeah, we'd love to hear that.
Yeah, no, I think a constant theme when I look back is just sort of following my interests more than anything, really understanding that, really helping my interest guide sort of where I go next and sort of what I get exposed to and what, I'm open to. But, I did equity research, covered enterprise software companies, so B2B software companies, not B2C. And I found that really fascinating. I actually really still love equity research. I think it's a phenomenal job. But I think there were a couple of things that sort of I struggled with that I knew that, okay, maybe this is not the long-term solution for me in terms of a career. One was equity research doesn't have a direct business model. And what does that mean? Basically, most other sort of industries in the world, you sell a product or you sell a service or you sell a subscription, you're going to get paid right then and there. You provide some value to somebody, they're going to pay you directly for that value. Equity research is a little more indirect, where basically you're an analyst, you cover a bunch of stocks and you say, hey, I think Microsoft is a buy. The investors can then sort of choose. They say, okay, you know what? I agree with Sandeep. I don't agree with Sandeep. And if they do agree with me, then they place a trade with JP Morgan, and then that commission sort of indirectly comes as a way to sort of pay for me. It's still indirect. Somebody could find my research really valuable in helping them form their own sort of investment thesis. But they could never trade with JP Morgan. Maybe if JP Morgan doesn't offer the best rates, Goldman Sachs offers better rates, maybe they go and execute the trade somewhere else. So that piece of it made it really difficult because it ended up becoming, equity research ends up being a cost center. As a result of that, really, people think of it as a cost center. And when you kind of in an environment where your division or your department is a cost center, people are really just trying to optimize costs. And they're not thinking about how to generate revenue. That was kind of one learning that I kind of figured out over the course of my 5 years there was I want to be in a place where it's a very direct business model where it's like, hey, if I do good work, more likely than not, we're going to get paid for that. And that means we're going to all get compensated appropriately for what we're doing. So that was one thing. And then, the second piece of it was just, I found software just really fascinating. It's a really interesting, dynamic industry, a lot of really cool personalities as well. Just like you kind of have some big personalities in finance with like a Jamie Dimon or a Sandy Weil, like, you have Mark Benioff and you have Larry Ellison and you have all these like iconic founders in the industry that I could see just covering these companies. I could see that these companies are growing 30, 40, 50%, and they're a couple $1 billion in scale. That was something special. So I knew that the growth was kind of there, and I wanted to move in that direction. So that was a big reason why I decided to sort of switch into software. I think the third sort of piece of it that kind of became a prerequisite for doing that was moving out of New York and into San Francisco, going to the Bay Area. And it's kind of the same thing where, if you want to work at a big bank, more likely than not, and maybe this is pre-COVID sort of views and sort of dampened by COVID, but you had to work in New York. That's kind of where you want to go, or if you want to go to London, maybe those sort of the financial hubs that you'd want to work at. For tech, it became very clear to me that I had to move to San Francisco. That was the hub. And it's like, that's where all the opportunity is. So that was one of the other decisions of, hey, we got to leave New York. As much as I love New York, I would love to have stayed, ended up realizing that I need to make a switch there as well.
How was the move to San Francisco? And can you maybe walk us through some of the challenges that you faced? Because moving from finance and from a big bank to actually working in tech involves kind of like a lot of prerequisites for that. So what kind of challenges did you face in the process?
Yeah, no, I think they're sort of personal and professional challenges, right? I mean, New York and San Francisco are two very different cities. So that there was kind of a challenge. And, I don't think me or my wife at the time when we moved, I don't think we were really fully sort of the Bay Area folks. I think we're still very much New Yorkers in the way sort of how we are in our personal lives. So that was sort of one challenge. But I think the other thing from the professional side is, when you work at a bank, you're working at a very almost a unique sort of type of organization, in that most banks are screening for, especially in the investment banking side, they're kind of screening for a certain type of person, a certain type of how you think through problems. Are you like an analytical thinker? Are you a top-down thinker? Are you able to sort of deduce, logic? Are you able to sort of logically go through different problems, break it down into small problems and sort of solve those, and then kind of come back like that? That's kind of the thinking around banking, I guess, in a lot of ways. And I think consulting is very similar in that way. So you end up in an environment where you're you're surrounded by other people that are kind of very similar to you. There might be, different people, obviously, but kind of how they think about the world is very different, is very similar to you. When you move into a corporate world, when you move into an organization that has all sorts of different functions, and being the finance person, suddenly I was, one of the fewer people that kind of had that analytical sort of mindset or sort of the way that I thought about problems. And kind of the simplest way that I can describe it is, the head of sales doesn't become the head of sales because they know how to run Excel well, and they know how to model well, or they know how to think about sort of they're really good at sales. They're really good at selling. They're really good at building a sales organization, scaling a sales organization. That's their expertise. Same thing with marketing. They're really good at marketing. These are things that they don't necessarily think about the world the same way. Whereas in banking, you kind of are combined with other people that sort of think about the world the same way. So, in a lot of ways, it was really great, but it was also a challenge because you kind of went from an environment where there were a lot of people that were very similar to me to an environment there was just a lot of variety. And I think the biggest thing that I had to sort of do or unlearn or learn was really just learn to adapt to the different ways that people were thinking about the world and understand their view, respect their expertise, respect their view, and sort of figure out how we can find some common ground to go achieve the things that we want to go achieve, and really start to speak the same language with the other folks.
Yeah, absolutely. So that makes a lot of sense. So what would you say are things that you did as part of kind of like your college experience that kind of prepared you to become kind of like this easily adaptable person and be able to kind of like one kind of acquaint yourself to the finance world, and two kind of like move with such an ease and kind of overcome all of those challenges. So what things did you do on campus, whether it is like part of any clubs or any organizations that kind of prepared you to be where you are today?
Yeah, no, I think, I think the probably the one big thing is just being, and it's like partly college, but also just beyond college, is just being naturally curious. I think just being, naturally curious, which usually means that you're kind of open to new ideas. You're open to new ways. You're not sort of so fixed in the way things have been, that you're open to sort of saying, hey, maybe there's something that I can learn here. And that was kind of the approach that I took. It took me a while to sort of figure it out when I moved to software, but I was like, oh wow, this is different. And if I want to be successful here, I have to change. And kind of having that mentality of sort of the, some people call it the growth mindset, of just kind of figuring out how you grow. I think in terms of sort of school, the things that prepared me specifically for finance, definitely ended up, I think now you guys have like this is like a finance or a business finance like major that where you take some courses at Simon and you also take some courses at Rochester. That wasn't quite there. I kind of just did it. I think they used to call it a certificate or something. And frankly, I didn't really care so much about the certificate, but I just realized from my summer when I did Merrill Lynch between sophomore and junior year, I was like, hey, I don't really know accounting. And accounting is a language of finance. And I really need to sort of button up if I want to be able to like just understand what people are saying when I'm in a finance world, is I need to know the basics. I need to know the language. And so those were some of the things that were really impactful in sort of doing the job per se. But then I'd say, the other things, it's funny because there's so many things that I did, looking back. If you would ask me like, hey, what was like the most impactful sort of course or whatever you did, none of it has to do with economics or math. It actually, there was the late Dean Burgett. He taught a couple of courses in music, the history of African-American music, the history of jazz. And that opened me up to a world that was very different and very interesting. And then also kind of made it easier to have conversations with people and build relationships with people, because it wasn't just, hey, here's just, this robot that does economics and math. Here's a human being who's got a little bit more depth to them, a little bit more experience. And so I think that is really important in sort of constantly sort of expanding the horizons, such that you give your shot to, to your question about how do you sort of adapt yourself, is the more you kind of experience yourself, the more likely that you're going to have something in common with somebody new that you meet. And if you're kind of, even if you don't have something in common, the more open you are to like learning from that person and just kind of understanding, even if it sounds weird, even if it sounds, crazy. I think just that kind of approach in general is super helpful. And I'd say, the Rochester curriculum, the way that it's structured, where you don't have sort of quote unquote required courses that you have to do the first year, I think is phenomenal. You get to specialize if you want to specialize, like I did with economics and math, but you also get to explore kind of anything. I needed a humanities cluster, I guess, and I'd already done French, so I didn't want to do a language. So I kind of chose music, and there's so much just personal benefit that I've gotten from doing that over the course of since I graduated, that I really appreciate.
Absolutely, absolutely. And that's kind of the advantage. I'm also doing a cluster in music, so I understand absolutely what you're saying. Yeah, I'm going to be doing a history of jazz. So yeah, it's important to kind of like build that and kind of also make use of the roster curriculum to build a diversified kind of set of knowledge, because that's important for yourself, for your knowledge to also learn about things that are interesting to you, and also create meaningful conversations about things that are with people that may be interested in the things that you're interested in as well. And we're going to talk about building relationships a little bit later on in the video. But yeah, thanks so much for sharing that. Okay, let's move on. Maybe let's talk a little bit more about what happens in kind of like the job world. Let's talk about the reality of the market. and kind of like what's going on in terms of the industry today, how it differs today from a few years ago, and yeah, I'd love to kind of like hear your take on that.
Yeah, no, I mean, obviously a lot has changed since, I was applying for jobs coming out of undergrad. So, but I think maybe I'll focus on the thing that, I don't think has changed, but that I think that, I made mistakes associated with, that I think a lot of students, currently make mistakes. Big part of why, we're having this conversation. We talk about sort of getting a job is a numbers game. At the end of the day, it's just that simple. And we talk about sort of the formula, how to get a job. Simplest thing that you can think of is just to say, hey, it's the number of applications that I put out there times the likelihood that I'm going to get a job. And it's just as simple as that. It's just you've got two sort of components, one of which you control, the former, in terms of how many places you can apply to, that you very much control. And then the percentage likelihood that you might get a job, you influence it. You don't necessarily control it, but you definitely can influence it, and you can sort of do different things to sort of increase that percentage that you might get a job. But then, I think the other thing that gets lost in this, the flip side of it is you only need one job. You only need one job. You can sort of, obviously you want to have multiple job offers or whatever, so that you have some pick. But just like, you chose to go to Rochester, you can't go to Rochester and then another school at the same time. So I think it's the same thing, where it's just like people kind of forget that, it's a numbers game. So just try to say like, hey, give your best shot at sort of expanding how many chances you are able to land one job. And you kind of just need one job. So I'll pause there, because I think a bunch of different ways we can go there, but that's I think probably the biggest sort of, I think, realization that I had. I was fortunate to have sort of over the course of, especially between my sort of throughout the course of my junior year, that fundamentally changed sort of how I think about it.
That's great, and I like how you so nicely put it. Like it's the kind of like a formula that you have to kind of follow. And I'm myself still in the process as well. And I see friends kind of diving into the process, applying absolutely every single day to a lot of companies. It really is a numbers game, but you also have to kind of fine tune some of the components that you put into that formula as well. So we can dive a little bit deeper in that. And so, what would you say are the top resources that you used that helped you as you went through that process and applied the formula? And what kind of things do you keep in mind to avoid some of the mistakes that people usually tend to make?
Yeah, no, I'd say, and kind of going back to that formula of, number of applications and then the percentage likelihood that you get a job offer, in the number of applications, I think the number one thing that so many students get wrong, and something, by the way, I admit I got wrong myself, is, we'll apply to like 3 jobs and then we'll just wait. And then we'll get 1 rejection. And we'll be like, oh shit. And then we got 2 more. And then we get another rejection. And you get another rejection. Suddenly you're all out. And you think that you're this hopeless case that's never going to get a job. But it's 3 things that you applied to. The likelihood of you getting one of those, unless you had a strong sort of connection into the company, is very, very low. And I think the big thing that folks need to realize, when I went to MuleSoft, the company in San Francisco, we looked at hiring. Hiring was our biggest priority. And so we did a bunch of analysis to say, where do we get our best hires, or where do we just even get hires? And here's the percentage of people, if you apply online to a job posting, at least for MuleSoft, and I'm pretty sure this is kind of the same for a lot of organizations, probably worse for a lot of other organizations as well, like a big bank, they get tons of applications. The likelihood that you get a job offer from applying just directly online is 0.14%. 0.14%. So if you have 1,000 applicants, 14 get an offer. And this is like basically if they literally just sort of put the information online, and that's it. And so that doesn't mean that the 9,986 people that didn't get a job all suck. That means nothing. It actually tells you nothing about those people. Those people could be brilliant in their own ways. But if that's the only thing that they did, you can't expect to get a job that way. So kind of goes back to that numbers, it's a numbers game. And really the biggest thing that you have, the biggest lever that you have under your control is to apply to as many jobs as possible. And once I kind of figured that out, I realized, you know what, I'm going to have a goal of every week, I'm going to apply to at least 2 jobs. I'm going to find 2 jobs. I'm going to apply every week to those 2 jobs. And that's going to take some time. Maybe I have to tweak my resume a little bit. Maybe I have to tweak my cover letter a bit. But I kind of just set a goal to say, and you know, you can figure out what goal you want to have, you know, whether it's 2, whether it's 5, whatever it is. But have something, because that put the power back in my hands as I was going through the search, because it can feel very powerless and can feel very helpless because you're just kind of waiting on somebody to hopefully give you, you know, hey, can you come in for an interview? So it kind of, for me, just helped just for me to just feel more in power of the situation versus feeling like, okay, you know, this is left up to fate and who knows whether I'll get it and whatever happens. You can kind of take some of that control. So that's maybe on the number of applications, number of, you know, places, the volume side of it, if you will. Turning over to the conversion side, you know, going back to that 0.14% was the percentage of people that sort of got straight through from an application to a job offer. We looked at referrals. So when employees refer a candidate to the company, what was the likelihood of that person getting a job offer? And it was literally 14%. So it was literally 100 times more effective to go the referral route, to have some form of connection into the company so that somebody at the company who already works at the company, who kind of already has a sense of, you know, what the company is about and, you know, what kinds of people are going to be good in this environment, for them to sort of give you, you know, that warm intro or that sort of, hey, nod of approval of saying, hey, I think this person is going to be, you know, I think Yousef is going to work out. Like, I think at the very least, I think you should interview with Yousef and you can figure it out whether you want to keep going forward or not. But it was 14% of those referrals. So when you kind of think about it that way, it's you know, you can definitely you have to do the numbers game because there's kind of a bare minimum that you need to have in order to have a shot. And then the other things you can do is for the ones that, you know, for the companies that you're most excited about, you know, maybe apply to, call it 50 companies, and maybe there are 10 that you really, you know, or 5, whatever it is, that you really, really, you know, you're like, oh, that would be my dream job. I would love to work there. Like, let's game plan, let's figure out how you can connect with people within that organization. And I think a lot of times students kind of think of it from the recruiting, from the hiring manager or the recruiting side of the house, where it's like, oh, I need to put my resume and cover letter in front of the recruiter. And I just encourage them to go, you know, just beyond that. Like, yeah, you can do that. Obviously, you want them to see it, but, you know, go find people that, hey, if you're a software engineer, go find a software engineer who works at that company, who's maybe, you know, 2 years out. So connect with them. Try to see if you can connect with them, and try to like reach out on LinkedIn. When I was looking for jobs, LinkedIn kind of just started out and it was kludgy and it wasn't exactly the tool that it is today. I think there's a lot of opportunity for folks to sort of go down that route and make those connections.
Absolutely, absolutely. And that's where networking kind of like comes in as a really, really strong ally in order for you to kind of like give you a push into the process. And we're going to talk about networking a little bit later, but I'd like to kind of come back on how to deal with rejection. So today, one of the most frustrating things that I go through at the moment as I'm applying to jobs and internships, and I see my friends kind of like going through, which is a little tough. It's probably different from what you've experienced in the past. It's the fact that sometimes you apply and until like a little bit further in the process, you're not actually judged or evaluated by an actual person. So nobody is actually looking at you and saying, hey, Sandeep, I think you're fantastic. I think you'd be great for the job. It's an artificial intelligence system that is looking for keywords, looking for patterns, and then kind of giving you a certain score and evaluating whether or not you're going to go through the process or not. You can be an incredible candidate with a lot of assets and still get that rejection. And sometimes you get a lot of them. You've applied to 50, 100, 150 companies and you're still getting those rejections, those automated responses. You don't know anything about what is causing that. You don't have any feedback. And I myself tried to reach out to a few companies that rejected me, asking for feedback with unfortunately no response. And I'm saying that it's actually great, especially when we receive. I've gotten a couple of responses in the past from my personal experience. It's usually great to kind of reach out and ask for feedback. You never know. But sometimes, for most cases at least, you're gonna be in the blur. And so how do you deal with that? What kind of next steps can you take to kind of like change that?
Yeah, no, that I'm glad we're talking about this, because this happens to everybody. And this has happened throughout, right? Like I got, I think, 30 or 40 rejection emails before I got that email from JP Morgan saying, hey, come and do the super day with us this week. When I moved to my other job at MuleSoft in San Francisco, I was going to meet through a personal connection. I was going to meet with the CFO who ended up becoming my boss. And I think it was like on a Tuesday. And then that Saturday, I got one of those canned, automatic rejection emails from MuleSoft, because I have said, hey, I'm going to apply online. I'm also going to try to figure out how I can connect to people internally. And I said, well, I still have that meeting. The meeting hasn't been canceled on Tuesday. I'm just going to go and see sort of what happens. And ended up getting that job, ended up working at that company for 4 years. My dad ended up working at a place called Asian Development Bank for 16 years. He was rejected 3 times before he finally got that job. So a company where you end up spending a 16-year career at, you can be rejected 3 times before. Like, so I don't think, I think this is where, kind of the concept of like rejections are not personal. I think we take it personally, obviously, it's natural, it's human, but they're not personal. Kind of going back to that math of the 0.14, like just because those 9,986 people did not get an offer does not mean that that's a reflection of who they are as an individual, who they are as a professional. That's just not the reality of the situation. And I think you kind of have to separate those two things. A rejection is not sort of an estimate of what your self-worth is. It's just one point along the way. And I think that's something that it's difficult. It's difficult to do. I know I struggle with it. I still struggle with it, right? Like anybody's going to struggle with it. But I think it's also just helpful to like know that, hey, this is kind of a part of it. And I'm a big sports fan and a lot of different sports. I sort of look to sports in a lot of different ways as sort of that kind of guide, because if you look at baseball, for instance, the best batters are going to bat 30%. I think some of the greats are 40%, and they're like, oh my God, that person is just a genius. How the hell do they do that? But they're missing 60% of the time. That's 60 rejections, if you will, right? For every 100. And I think that's kind of the piece of it too. Like I follow tennis, percentage of first serves that you make versus percentage of second serves that you make. They're kind of, especially on the second serve side, it's like the difference between great and good is like a couple percentage points. 55% versus 52 can mean, you're either Roger Federer or somebody else. So I think a lot of this is first just recognizing that a rejection is not a personal thing. It's rarely a personal thing. So let me sort of capture that in sort of a couple of other ways as well, because it's also understanding when you're getting the rejection, right? If you've applied to a bunch of places and you get rejected from an automatic, whatever, AI bot, that's very different than if you get a rejection once you've had 4 interviews with the company, and at the final step, you feel very good, and then you get a rejection at that last step. You don't get the offer. It's very different. So, obviously and I've been in that second situation. I've been in the first, I've been in all the situations. And the second one is obviously the one that sort of really hurts, because you invest time, they invest in time in you. But that's sort of a different sort of situation than sort of the first situation. And I think a lot of students probably face more of the first one than the second one, in terms of you just applying to a lot of places. And I think a lot of this just kind of comes back to, hey, there's a game that's being played that's called the job offer, job market. And you got to figure out the rules of the game. Whether you paid it, whether you like it, it's kind of irrelevant. It's sort of what's happening. So if there's certain keywords that you need to have that the AI is going to pick up, try to sort of customize, optimize whatever that you send out to sort of give your best shot at the AI. Right? And there was a lot of stuff that I remember I had to do for finance where, we had to put sort of DCF there, discounted cash flow model, because that meant that, okay, this, that's going to get picked up. So you kind of know that there are certain ways that you can sort of play the game, if you will. Obviously, don't lie, don't do something that's like illegal, or don't do something that's, dishonest, but do something that, okay, you understand, here are the rules of the games. I'm going to try to do the best thing that I give myself my best shot. I think the other piece of it is you can play the game, and you can figure out, is there a different game that I should be playing? And I think this is where students kind of don't fully understand. And we'll talk a bit more about this when we talk about networking, but that's getting to a human. It's easy for an AI to reject, thousands of applications, because it's so rigid on like, hey, is it included, is it not included? And it's like, okay, it's easy for the person to do that, for AI machine to do that. What's different is if you play a different game with humans and you actually connect with humans. If you actually connect with people that work at the company, or people who, worked with people who worked at the company, or people who know people at the company, you're playing a different game. And that inherently, kind of going back to the math of, the referral getting you 14 percentage points versus 0.14, that's kind of the mode that you got to go, to just sort of figure out how to really get there. So I think, a couple of things. One, you just like, rejections are not personal. It's just, hey, it's a lot of times, and the other example I give is a close friend of ours who lives here in Austin with us. She was moving from New York. She ended up interviewing with a company, went pretty far, and pretty much went to the last round, and then got rejected, because they went with somebody who had a little bit more experience at the time. This was in August of last year. Obviously heartbroken. She really liked the company. They seemed to like her, and they kind of left it at good terms. So then she kind of, had to regroup and figure out where else. And she kind of reached out to them 2 months later and just said, hey, like, I noticed that there was another opening on the team. Would you be interested? Like, I really had a great time, and I feel like you guys had a great time getting to know me. And then within literally a week of that second email, she gets a job offer from that same company. So it's the kind of thing where, it's not personal. It's also not final, I think, is a bigger thing, kind of going back to both, my friend over here in Austin, and then my dad, who got rejected 3 times, ended up working at the place for 16 years. Like, it's not this like end all be all. It is just what it is. Sometimes the odds don't work out. And for me, sports kind of help illustrate that a lot. You can have the best team, but on a given day, you might not win. And the second piece is just, hey, understand the game that you're playing, and always think about, is there a different game that I could be playing to sort of help my odds? And sort of those are kind of the pieces.
Great. I think it's a great analogy, and it kind of like speaks to me, and I'm sure that's going to speak to a lot of people as well that may or may not be in the process right now as they're watching this video. And I think it's great to keep that in mind. It's great to kind of know the pieces that go into play in this game of applying to companies. It's also great to it's important to know yourself as well, kind of know your strengths and know some of the resources that you can use in order to become a better player at that game. And it happens sometimes, like, I think it's normal to kind of feel lost and look at your friends getting interviews while you're getting a lot of rejections, but sometimes it's an indicator. And as you said, Sandeep, and I think it's great, it's the difference between being rejected by an AI and being rejected by an actual person. Sometimes you have a connection, sometimes you don't. It's also important to kind of keep in touch and keep good terms with the company, especially if you like the company. It might suit you, it might not suit you, but you never know what can happen. You never know your odds. Just keep everything kind of like in your pocket and take the right steps towards your career. I think is something that you need to keep in mind. And it's okay to feel sad. It's okay to feel lost, but so long, like, you always remember that rejections are not personal. They're just kind of like sometimes an indicator of what you should maybe do differently. Yeah, I think that that will definitely help. And also, when we're talking about referrals, sometimes you come into college, you don't necessarily have like a big network. Sometimes you may be looking at your friends, and they may have networks. They might know friends of friends that know people at some companies that you want to work in. And I think it's and I think here we should talk about some like an example of a person that doesn't actually have a network, and how they can come like from kind of the ground up and kind of move to those rejections and kind of like change things. And I think for that, you have to learn how to do networking in a good way. And before COVID, at least, we used to have a lot of opportunities to meet employers in person. So we used to have like the career fairs in person, big events in person, people to come to campus. You could go to events and conferences yourself. And right now, everything is kind of like mostly going towards an online fashion, just because it's easier and more convenient for everybody. And I think it's something that people need to realize and people need to acquaint to. And it's kind of like changes how we network with people, and also changes the way that you approach people in the first place, in a good and in a bad way. And I think it will be interesting to talk about that. So let's demystify networking for everybody. So let's define. So what is networking to you, Sandeep?
Yeah, networking is very simply put the thing that I hate doing. Just like every other student, every other person is just like, oh, I go into a big room and there's, maybe 3 people who are the panelists who have these dream jobs and their lives are perfect. And, oh my God, if I could just for 1 minute, maybe get, like 2 seconds of their time, they glance at me, I glance at them, we talk for maybe 5 minutes. And then right at the end of it, they say, hey, Sandeep, you get the job. It's this like make-believe like situation that doesn't exist. It's just not real. And I think a lot of us kind of feel that pressure. I'm personally an introvert. So I used to hate going into these sort of big environments and just being like, oh my God, now like I have to go get a job. It's like, no, you don't have to do anything. There's nothing. You're there because you're interested in the people. You're interested in those roles and interested in those jobs. And there's so many other ways that you can think about networking. And the best way that I've found to think about networking that works for my personality, and I think works for a lot of others as well, is networking is just a form of developing professional relationships. So just like, it's a little bit easier maybe for all of y'all as college students to make friends, personal relationships, if you will. It's just figuring out how to make professional relationships. So, and just kind of like how you as an individual are, you have a personal side and you have a professional side. So just think of it as like the mirror image of how you make friends. It's kind of the same thing that you do from a networking perspective. At least that's how I think about what networking really is. And when you start to think about it that way, you kind of think about it a little bit differently. First thing that you do is you don't go with the immediacy of it, right? Just like you don't go to a person, you meet them for the first time, you say, oh my God, I want you to be my friend. Can you be my friend for the next 5 years or for life? You don't do that, right? Because you think about it, it happens more organically. You connect on a certain number of things that you might have in common, and you sort of catch up, you catch up some more, and it's sort of naturally over the course of time, friendships sort of happen as a result of that. The same thing on the professional side, same thing. Don't go in if you're going to go talk to somebody for the first time. Don't expect that they're going to just say, hey, you know what? I'm going to hire you right now. You know what? Actually, let me get you to talk to the CEO of our company. No, it's the first interaction that you have with somebody. And really what you're trying to do in that situation is just find a connection. Just the same way that you would try to, make a friend is from the professional side. You're just trying to find a connection. You're just trying to find something that you can connect with. Talking specifically about, how to do that when you don't have a network per se. I know that I'm an international student. My folks live in Cambodia. At the time, they were living in the Philippines. Like, I didn't really have a ton of people in the US. In fact, outside of my sister, who's a little bit older than me, like, didn't really have anybody in the US that I could sort of rely on or just talk to. So a lot of it was just on me to sort of help build it out myself, right? And I think there are kind of 2 things that students can probably do. One is figure out what you can control, right? I knew that I could control how much I could reach out to people that were in industries that I found really interesting, that were either Rochester alums, that, maybe we have that connection, even if we're very different people. Maybe folks who are Indian like myself, where we have a connection from sort of the country that we're from. Maybe people who maybe I saw on their LinkedIn profile or something that, they're a Buffalo Bills fan, which I'm a Buffalo Bills fan, fortunately, unfortunately, but you have a connection there somehow. So I think it's just figuring out sort of what are the people that you're looking for. I think there's kind of this Venn diagram of like, here are all the people that you've got that you might be interested in. And there's another sort of circle that's what are all the connections that you might have, and you're kind of looking for that intersection where it's people that you're kind of interested in, sort of the jobs that you're interested in, the people that you're interested in, and the people that you might have some connections with, and try to go after those folks and try to just reach out to them, just message them, call them if they've got the number, whatever it is, just reach out. And the simplest thing that you can do is you can just say, this is kind of the point about informational interviews. Just say, hey, I looked at your profile. I find it really interesting what you've done. I'm considering going down a similar path. I would love some advice from you. If you've got 10 to 15 minutes, can we set up some time? Just something as simple as that. It doesn't need to be super complicated. It doesn't need to be long. And in fact, don't make it long, make it very short, and to the point. And you'll be surprised how many people will connect, especially if they have some connection to you, especially if there is one of those connections, and I'm sure I'm missing out on a lot of other potential ways that you can, forms of connection, if you will. So that's something that you control. But, I kind of had the same thing where I was like, okay, I'm going to reach out to, 2 to 3 people a week that, I'm going to do some research. I'm going to go do some searches on LinkedIn, find different people and sort of just reach out to them. So that's something you control. I think other things that you can do, especially as a student, is you're actually really fortunate that you're in this organization that has all sorts of connections. Your professors might know somebody who works at those companies. Maybe they work with some of those people. You might have events, even if they're sort of virtual or in person or whatever. You might have folks that come visit. So it's just this like big wide hub of all this interaction, all these potential connections. And it's your job as the person who's looking for the job, it's your job to sort of make those connections a little bit easier for somebody else who might need to help you, right? So for a professor, maybe you're doing good in the class, they like you, kind of go to them after class and wherever they have office hours or whatever, and maybe look on their LinkedIn if they have a LinkedIn and see if they're connected to certain people. And just say, hey, I noticed you're connected to so-and-so. I'm really interested in learning more about that space. Is there something, is there somebody that you know that you can connect me with? So I think there's a lot of sort of creative ways. And I think this is the part that I get really excited about, because once you sort of once you get to that realization that it's really open-ended, and that can be really scary for a lot of students, right? Because you're used to, hey, if I apply to these many colleges and this whatever SAT score and this score and that GPA, whatever I'm going to get, you kind of want that simple formula. But once you kind of open it up and you make it more open-ended, you kind of actually let yourself be very creative and finding solutions and finding ways. I remember one of the ways that I got to JP Morgan was I just Googled, I couldn't find the recruiting manager. I didn't want to send a "to whom it may concern" header. I wanted to be direct to that person. And I just Googled recruiting manager, and then I typed in @jpmorgan.com because I knew that was their email sort of domain or whatever. And randomly, the recruiter happened to be involved in a nonprofit organization. And as part of that, there was some PDF where they had a list of all the donors or whatever, and that person's email was right there. And I just kind of plucked that out and I said, hey, I forget, I think it was Dear Jennifer or something. I said, hey, I'd love to sort of spend some time. Here's my application. Here's my resume. So I think there's all sorts of really cool ways to do it. Going back maybe to sort of the events piece of it, if you do have events, don't feel again, if you kind of go back to, this is building a relationship that's going to start today and hopefully continue going years in the future. Think about how you can kind of get their attention in a way that's differentiated than everybody else. Because I can guarantee you, as someone who's been part of panels, I forget 90% of the people that I meet. 90% of the kids that I meet, I'll forget them, because suddenly you're at this place and you get 20 students that are coming up to you and talking to you. You're just not going to remember. So to me, also for me, that kind of worked out as an introvert, because it's I didn't want to be one of the 20. I just felt really socially awkward in those situations. So what I would do is I would just take notes as to what they were saying throughout the event. And then I would find their email through, whoever it was at Rochester, or, whoever sort of knew that information. And I would just say, reach out to them personally and just say, hey, so-and-so, like, I really, thank you so much for your time yesterday at the panel. I found these two things very interesting. Kind of be specific. So it's not just like, oh, I found it interesting. It's like, no, I found these two things really impactful. I'd love to learn more. Do you have 10, 15 minutes for a quick phone chat? And then you'll be surprised how well that works. So
that's really important, actually. And yeah, it's just like putting it again in a very nice way, like I put it earlier. Just like it's all about building relationships that are professional in nature, and also being creative in ways that you connect with people. Connections are really, really important in terms of like, one, allowing you to kind of have a better perspective about, one, the industry, two, maybe the job or the company that you're looking at, and three, the type of people that work there as well. So it can be like someone that you get to know at an event. It can be someone that you kind of like reach out to on social media, and that kind of like comes out. I'm hearing this story over and over again, especially now as I hear about friends getting internships and getting accepted into companies. It's all about like kind of building relationships and kind of going through the process of reaching out and going on those things that we call informational interviews, just to ask questions, get to know things, get to know people. And one of my friends actually just recently got an offer at a company, and it was all about kind of like getting that first conversation going, getting your foot in the door, kind of diving into the process, asking the right questions, going into the process itself, and kind of strengthening the relationships with the people that you get to meet along the way. And it can be very intimidating. So you're an introvert yourself, I'm an introvert myself as well. And so it can be very scary to kind of like go to some random person that you've never known about, zero connections on LinkedIn, and you want to send that note and that message, and you kind of like stare in front of the blank, like kind of cursor kind of tilting, and you don't know what to write. And so,
yeah.
So you mentioned earlier, like asking for 10 to 15 minutes of their time, but I don't know, like what kind of like more specific advice, like can you include in the note kind of seem more interesting? We also talked about kind of building a connection and finding something that kind of relates you to the person that you're connecting to. So let's have a template to present to everybody. Let's say you found that person that you want to connect with at that company or that organization. What do you do now?
Yeah, no, it's funny. It's like you're talking about that, and my anxiety is going up just by virtue of like, doing that. It's a very anxiety. You're like, oh my God, I'm gonna hit send, and it's gonna go in the ether, and like there's just anxiety to it, and that's okay. That's okay. That's part of it. Just be courageous a little bit. Just hit send. Before you hit send, here's some things that I think would be really hopefully helpful for you. I think a couple of things, right? One is you found that person, you did some research. There's a reason why you're reaching out to that person in particular, right? And usually there are kind of two pieces that I encourage all students to focus on. One is, what's the connection that you have, if there is any, right? Because you don't have to be, there are people that I reached out to that are not Rochester alums. There are people who had like quote unquote zero connection with, but there was something that I could find some sort of, hey, this is what piqued my interest in sort of you. And then the second thing is really just kind of get to like, hey, I'm really interested in learning about this from you specifically. And really it kind of goes back to like, what you want to be able to do is not something where it's like somebody is like, if you keep things open-ended in that sort of outreach, if you keep it very open-ended, I think people can kind of be turned off by it. If you ask for a job and it's like the first time you're meeting them, it's the same thing as asking somebody to marry you if you've met them for the first time, right? There's just like, it's not going to happen. So I think it's just really, people want to help. Most, in my experience, most folks, especially alums, most sort of adults, professional adults who've been working, they want to help because they know they've been in that same situation. They were there 10, 15, whatever, 20, 30 years ago. So they just kind of go in with that. Don't expect anything, but just know that people, for the most part, want to help. And if you have a connection with them, they're more likely to help because they kind of see like a version of themselves, like a younger version of themselves in the person who's reaching out. and they know how lost they felt. They know how much anxiety they had around it. So they want to kind of help. So just know that people are trying to help, but make it easier for them to help you, right? Like, don't send a long life story about, hey, I was, born in this place, and then I moved to this place, and then I, been here, and then I decided to do this course at Rochester, but then I switched my majors, and it's like, we don't care about that. We can talk about that in person if it comes up, but kind of be to the point and just say, hey, I found your information through XYZ. It seems like, I'm really interested in sort of the job that you have or the career path that you've taken. I've been doing more research in these roles, and I would love to have 10 to 15 minutes to ask you, questions about, how to get into the industry, or how to progress, what the typical career progression looks like, and also just get other sort of tips and advice. And that way, you're kind of doing sort of, you're hitting it hard very quickly. You're not that generic sort of, here's what's like generic outreach. You're kind of more specific to that person. And this takes time, right? This takes time. And the more you do it, and it's just like with everything, more practice, you're going to get better at it, and you can be able to do it faster. But really, you want to have some intentionality behind it. I think a lot of students, even students, when they get to the point where they're like, hey, I really, now I want to outreach, they lose the intentionality. They don't talk about it. Like, why did you reach out to this person? What about this person is interesting to you, right? And try to sort of drive that home, because then that's going to make them sort of more interested in talking to you, because they feel like, hey, I'm, one of the few people that can sort of help them with this because of my experience, right? If somebody reaches out to me who's in finance, and wants to make the switch to software, I'm like 99% of the time I'm going to respond, yeah, let's chat, because I know exactly what that situation is, and I know that not a ton of people have done it, and I know that I felt very lost when I was doing that sort of transition. So I think kind of really sort of tailoring it a little bit more, and it kind of goes back to sort of that friendship, cultivating relationships, it kind of just figuring out who that person is. And then the second thing I just mentioned is, if you're able to then get on sort of the conversation with them, I used to always end every conversation that I would have with somebody with, who else do you think would be good for me to talk to learn more? Because that naturally is, again, going back to not somebody who has this deep network in the US, somebody who is trying to figure it out. Like, let them help me sort of build that network, right? And if they're the ones who are going to sort of vouch for me a little bit and saying, hey, you should talk to Sandeep, that makes it easier, right? And what I like to do is always think about it from the perspective of the person who's trying to help me. Like, how do I make it easier? So I would offer up like, hey, and I say, hey, who else can I talk to? And they say, hey, you should go talk to my friend Yousef. He's pretty good at, he'll be really helpful. Then I follow up with like, hey, would you like me to send an email to them and CC you? Would that be easier, or would you prefer to just make that connection, directly and just sort of, me? Like, give them options so that you're kind of still in control. You're kind of like managing the project, if you will, and they can choose how involved they want to be. And more often than not, people are busy, and they'll probably be like, yeah, why don't you send this email? This is the email. CC me on it, and then I can respond to Yousef and say, hey, Yousef, this person's worth your time. You should, if you've got a couple of minutes, please find some time. So kind of think from the perspective of, how do you make it easier for somebody else to help you, versus kind of, a lot of times kids would, and I've done this as well, right? It was like, who else can I talk to? And then I go try to reach out to that person separately, or I just expect that person to connect me with them. They don't have to do anything, right? It's on me at the end of the day. So hopefully that helps kind of, I don't know, bring down the anxiety associated with, reaching out to people, and sort of just knowing that this is, I think the other thing is just knowing that this is something that will take practice. You're not going to be like the Uber, like whatever, like, you're not going to make like lifelong relationships with everybody that you meet. It's just a matter of kind of doing it and get comfortable and try to find how you are going to do it the way that you feel that sort of best represents you.
Yeah, absolutely. And it also reminds me of what we talked about when what we said we were talking about companies as well. I think that it's also kind of a numbers game as well. It's also about how many people you try to connect to. So it takes practice. You're not going to be able to connect with 100 people like right away if you're just starting out. But it's also a numbers game in terms of like connecting to as many people as possible and trying to build relationships with people. So it's one, trying to find the right people to connect to, and two, trying to connect with as many people as possible, because there's a problem that I faced myself, and I've been facing this since freshman year, and even right now I try to connect with people, but sometimes if it's people that are not alumni or people that have connections with people that I know, they'll most likely not accept my LinkedIn invitation or not respond to my notes, even though I sent something really nice and really short and really sweet. And I try to be as precise as possible. Sometimes I do not receive a response. Myself, I have not received a response from someone I tried to connect with a couple of days ago, and that's okay. I think that what you mentioned, kind of like the timeline that you need to follow is just with the things that you need to keep in mind when you try to connect with people. So don't send really long messages, really detailed, because some of the details, let's be honest, like they're not really relevant. And also trying to maybe like find 10 or 15 minutes of their time for a call, because having a phone conversation or a conversation through Zoom or through video is also really good in terms of like establishing that first relationship, I believe, and also trying to find that piece of connection, whether it is the major, or the background, or anything, and trying to kind of like expand on that and ask questions. I think those are like really important things, and not being scared of actually like making the right steps towards making those communications. And also something that I'd like to maybe dive a little bit into is getting feedback. I think like
Yeah.
people sometimes are afraid of making mistakes. They're like, I want my message to be as perfect as possible. I want this conversation to be as perfect as possible. Whenever they connect, they're like, oh, how do I not mess this up? So what do you have to say about that? Like
Yeah.
how do you not mess this up?
Yeah. No, I mean, like I think the first thing, and it's going to be somewhat counterintuitive, is know that you're going to mess it up. Like, and that's okay. Like everyone messes up. Like, people who are like super successful today are, it's not like they've been perfect throughout their entire lives. Sometimes some of them have made huge mistakes and they've recovered from it, right? So it's knowing that this is part of a process. It's part of, like, a lot of what we're talking about is, you can apply it to the job search when you're a student looking for your first job outside of undergrad. But really, this is really just a career-long process and career-long sort of habits and hygiene that you should have around sort of how you go about it, because it comes up, it comes up everywhere. It comes up, early career, mid-career, late career. It comes up everywhere. So I think, I think what you should do is not sort of overly penalize yourself because you weren't perfect or whatever. I think what you should do from a feedback perspective, I think there are kind of probably two things that I'd sort of highlight. One is if possible, right? I used to do this for my interviews. Anytime I'd be on a phone or like do an interview with somebody, that day itself, while it's still kind of fresh in my mind, ideally like right after, doesn't always happen. Maybe you're going to another, whatever, you got back to back, so it might not be possible. But as close to when the event happened, like just take some notes. Just take some notes as, hey, what questions did they ask me, right? And what did I say to the best of your ability? Because sometimes it's all a blur and it's hard. But just take notes by yourself. Because for me, what I realized when I started to do that, I kind of got the feedback that I needed, because I was able to see like, oh, they asked me this, but I answered this, and I didn't really answer the question. And, or the answer wasn't, I know, like, I didn't really feel like confident when I was answering that question. So that's something I need to work on. Like, so you naturally sort of have a, like, hey, here's how I get better at this, right? Because you've kind of gone through your process. The other thing is just asking for feedback outright from people. And I think this kind of goes back to where sort of in the stage are you of, being an applicant? Are you early stage where, AI is just basically reading you? Are you at the first interview? Are you the second, third, fourth interview? Usually, if you've kind of made it to the interview round, and typically if you've kind of gotten to the second round at least of interviews, whatever that is, in different companies have different processes. But by then, like, it's not uncommon for candidates to ask, like, hey, I'm really bummed that, things didn't work out, but would really appreciate, I'm just trying to get better for myself. Would really appreciate that, would any feedback, like what, is there something that I could have done? Is there something that I could have done differently, or whatever, just help me. Just if you've got any feedback, I'd really appreciate it. And usually if you kind of word it in kind of a, again, short, to the point, and just kind of just say, hey, I'm just trying to get better myself. Most people are going to respond to something. Some companies have, like a blanket rule from a legal perspective or something. They say no one's allowed to give feedback. But most other companies, it's up to the individual if they want to give the feedback or not. And you might get some very interesting nuggets of feedback. So I think understanding sort of where you're in the process, if you're kind of further along in the process, I think it's much more common, or at least less uncommon, to ask for feedback. And if you're earlier on, I think you kind of have to figure out sort of what you feel is working, what you feel is not working. And this is where, you've kind of mentioned a couple of times, you see friends who might be getting offers, you see friends who might be getting interviews, like, talk to them. They might have figured something out, right? Or they might be doing something a little bit differently than you are. And maybe it just requires somebody outside of yourself, right? Just the outside perspective to say, hey, actually, maybe you want to try doing this. Maybe you want to try doing X, Y, Z. And those things are really important in terms of figuring out, where you are along the process, and then, what kind of feedback you need, because the feedback is different at different stages of sort of that job application process. So, it's something that feedback is really important, and not everyone's going to feel necessarily comfortable if they don't necessarily have that connection to you to give you feedback. So I don't think you should expect to get feedback, but I think you should also push to try to get feedback as much as you can. And I think you can use definitely the resources at the Career Center. I know I use that. I worked for the Career Center when I was there, had a wealth of resources, wealth of, knowledge there, a wealth of people that were able to sort of do mock interviews with me or whatever it was, where I could say, okay, you know what, this is where I feel like I stumble. Like, I've got, for these 3 questions, I feel pretty solid about, and these, 2 questions, when they get into that, I kind of get a little wishy-washy. And so I need to figure out like how I want to get, solidify that. So I think it's just figuring out what stage you are, what feedback is most relevant. And don't be afraid to ask for feedback. The worst case is they don't give you feedback, which is the same case that if you didn't ask for it, right? So the best case is they give you feedback, and then that changes how you go about it going forward.
Absolutely. And I think it's important to kind of like make mistakes at first, and see how that gets you. So make mistakes with friends, make mistakes with the Career Center, make mistakes with alumni, and kind of try to learn for that. If you get feedback, that's great. If you don't get feedback, it's time to reflect as well. That's where taking notes actually becomes really important. So you can kind of like reevaluate what you did and improve on that. See how you reacted, because answering questions and asking questions yourself when you're kind of like in a stressful type of environment, like when you're talking, you have to think right away. It's very different from actually being in a laid out environment and kind of like rethinking everything and taking your time. So you might be able to notice a few patterns and a few things that you might not notice right away. And so it's really important to kind of like use all of that and also take the right actions. So make use of the resources, talk to people at the Career Center. If you hear of friends getting offers, talk to them, congratulate them, ask them for feedback, ask them for advice. If you want to go for mock interviews, you have a bunch of resources at your disposal. And if you connect with people, always ask for feedback. And also something that you mentioned earlier is help them help you. So kind of help them make the process easier for you if you want to expand the network, if you want to connect with other people. I think that thing that you mentioned about like the what you asked them towards the end of the call is to see if you can connect further is actually very important. It's something that I think a lot of people should do because it can open you a lot of doors. So thank you so much for sharing all of that, Sandeep. So let's say right now, just to wrap it up, I'm a normal student. I just came to the OFR. I'm looking at all these opportunities, and it's kind of like it's a big monster of a thing that I'm looking at, and it seems pretty scary. So when should I start, and how should I start?
Yeah, no, that's it's obviously a tough question because it's a personal question as well, right? As to when the person is ready to me, I think there are a couple of things is I think a lot of what happens in organizations like a university, and I went to B school as well, a business school, and then it's kind of similar sort of dynamics play out, is that people start looking for jobs when other people start looking for jobs. And then magically, people start applying for either banking, consulting, private equity, all these jobs that have very structured interview and sort of job processes. And magically people that maybe don't want to do it, maybe don't really have an interest, but then they see other people doing it, and then suddenly you get herd mentality. So I think the thing to recognize is, yes, that's one way to do it. I don't necessarily think that's the best way to do it. I think it's really figuring out what you're interested in. And I think a lot of students feel this burden or feel this pressure that, oh my God, like I have to figure out my career with this job. Like, what is my career? Like, what's my 40 years or 50 years of work life? Like, all depends on this one. It's like, no, like I've had 3-4 jobs in the 12, 15 years that I've been sort of out of undergrad. So it's like, it's the first job that you're going to have. So I think you take the pressure off a little bit yourself, right? To take the pressure off a bit and sort of recognize it for what it is. I think is the first thing, is when you're kind of coming to it, is really just realize, hey, it's the first thing that you're going to do. And a lot of people, I don't know, point something percentage of people probably stay in the first job through the end of the career. Everybody moves. So with that, I think it's just figuring out what you're interested in. From my perspective, I've always felt whatever you naturally gravitate to from an interest perspective, if you can find some alignment between what you do naturally, what you find naturally interesting, and sort of potential jobs, potential roles, is sort of the best way to go about it. Instead of saying, hey, I want to be, XYZ analyst or whatever it is, I think it's easier and better to start with, hey, these are my interests. I really enjoy digging into, for me, it was company financials, like annual reports of different companies. I really enjoy that. I just find it really fascinating. I learn a lot, it's whatever. I really like looking at how stocks move, what makes them tick. When I was switching over from finance to software, it was like, I kind of understand how software companies work from sort of the public side of the world. Really want to understand what it looks like inside when you're working at one of these companies and you're growing 50, 60, 70% year over year. What does that look like? What's that? So kind of start with the interest and then kind of map the roles to those interests. And I think you're just going to end up in a much better position, because I think a lot of students, and not just students, a lot of adults do this, right? And I'm as guilty of it as anybody else, right? We get caught up in sort of what's happening around us a bit sometimes. And we don't really do that upfront work to understand, hey, what are our interests? And then how do I go find a job that matches to my interests? Usually what a lot of people do is it goes, oh, that's a job application that's open on some site. I'm going to apply to that and I'm going to hopefully get it. But without really thinking about, hey, is that even a job that you want? Is that even a job that you care about? Is that even a company that you care about? Is that those kinds of things? So I think it's a lot easier. And I think for somebody to listen to this, for us chatting, I think it can kind of feel like, oh my God, there's so many things that I have to do in order to get a job, right? I got to go apply to a bunch of different places. I got to go LinkedIn message a bunch of people. I got to go, do all this other extra stuff just to get a job. Like, I think when you match your interests to the types of jobs that are out there, like it doesn't feel like work at all. It ends up becoming something that you naturally gravitate to. When I was interested in getting a job in finance, I was naturally sort of reading the Wall Street Journal every week. So it just felt like, oh, like I could then say, I could reach out to somebody if there was something in the news about somebody at JP Morgan. I could be like, hey, I just learned, I just read about this. And then when I connect with that person at JP Morgan, I can be like, hey, what's, can you help me understand what happened over there? Like, this is like really interesting. It's really fat. Like what happened there? Like, so you can kind of make these connections. and it becomes less of work and becomes more of just like, hey, no, I'm just trying to like learn and get better and sort of fuel my interests. So, I think that's the biggest sort of, how do you start and when do you start? I think a lot of it comes down to, the thing that I would highly recommend, and this is where I think the Career Center is going to be super helpful for you, right? Because they've got the trained professionals who can help map those things out. So just sort of go with interests first and sort of get to mapping to jobs versus vice versa.
Yeah, absolutely. And just like kind of stressing on what you said right now, it's good to be exploratory, especially when you're just starting out. So you can be open and have an open mind to whatever career might come your way, or whatever person you might be willing to connect to. And also, something that I would want to add to that is maintaining those relationships. Let's say that you're now connected to a few people that are interesting. I was talking to a friend actually yesterday, and he said something really important. And we were talking about this, and he said that sometimes he basically reads a lot of articles that are related to the field of interest that he's kind of like working on right now. And sometimes he reads articles, and it reminds him of like some of the discussions that he's had with the people that he connected with, where it is alumni or even people at company that he communicated with. And it's good to kind of like send that message and say, hey, I've been reading this book / article, I've been watching this video, listening to this podcast, made me think of that conversation. I think it would be great for you to have a look at this. I think those small messages can have big impact in one, helping you kind of like refine and maintain those relationships, and two, even learn yourself, because you can engage in another conversation. It can lead to something else or to another connection. You never know. And so those are small steps that you can do and that you can improve on and practice in, and also using the resources the Career Center and the advisors, and also talking to alumni, can become better at the future as you go into applying and kind of like drawing naturally into kind of like that application and those things that kind of like direct you into what you want to do in the future after graduation, whether it's just grad school or even becoming a young professional. So
if I can just like, I just want to emphasize that point that you made about like, keep those relationships up. Because it's crazy to me, because I'll have like conversations with students and I feel like I connected with them. I feel like they connected with me, and then I never hear from them ever again. And I think with the way that as a student you might want to think about it is, and sometimes students might feel like a little bit awkward about, oh, I'm going to reach out to this person again or whatever. But just think of it as like, to me, it's just like, it's an old friend, right? Just like if you haven't talked to an old friend and you've got along really well, like you would love a message from them, right? Like a text message from them just saying, hey, how are you doing? Hey, I came across this song or whatever. I came across this podcast. Like, I think you'd be interested. Just think of it that way. It doesn't have to be, every interaction does not have to be this perfect, like cover letter, email, whatever, it's like, it could just be, hey, I read this recently, or I listened to this podcast recently, or I did this that kind of reminded me of the conversation, and kind of just perfectly as you said it. And you'll be surprised how much you would stand out, because most people, even if they get to that first step of like finally making that connection, they don't keep the momentum going. And I think that's something that's such a missed opportunity for students and for people in general, right? Is continue those relationships. And it really doesn't take a lot. It's just, like you said, just one quick note. That's it.
Yep. So it's those small steps that you take that usually have the most impact. And it's important to keep them in mind, because most people don't usually realize them. So I think, it's been a fruitful conversation. So thank you so much for sharing all of that, Sandeep. And